What would you do if your neighbor accused you of spying on them before you even had a chance to introduce yourself? I never expected my first weekend in our new home to turn into a nightmare, but that's exactly what happened. My husband Dan and I had just moved into what we thought was a quiet, peaceful suburban neighborhood, a fresh start, a place where we could finally settle down. The moving boxes were still scattered around, and I had barely unpacked my coffee maker when I felt the first uneasy prickle of being watched. At first, I thought I was imagining it. It's normal for neighbors to be curious about the new people on the block, right? But this wasn't curiosity. Across the street, in the large bay window of a pale blue house with perfectly trimmed hedges, she was staring. A middle-aged woman in a faded robe, her hair twisted into a messy bun, holding a steaming mug in her hands as she locked eyes with me. She didn't look away when I glanced in her direction. She didn't smile. She just stood there, staring, her expression unreadable but heavy with something that made my stomach twist. I forced myself to ignore it. Maybe she was just the nosy type. I grabbed my coffee, stepped onto the porch, and tried to enjoy the morning air. But before I could take a second sip, the front door across the street swung open with force. The woman stepped out onto her lawn, then, to my growing horror, started marching toward me. "Excuse me," she called, her voice sharp enough to cut through the crisp morning air. I barely had time to react before she reached my driveway. Her eyes were cold and calculating, the type of gaze that made you feel guilty even when you had done nothing wrong. "I need to talk to you." I swallowed hard, setting my coffee down. "Sure," I said, keeping my tone polite. "How can I help you?" She crossed her arms, her stare unwavering. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" I blinked, caught off guard. "I live here?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't like people sneaking around. I saw you watching my house this morning. You better not be spying on us." For a second, I thought she was joking. But her expression was completely serious. My mind raced. I hadn't even noticed her house before I saw her staring at me. I wasn't watching her windows. I was drinking coffee on my porch, minding my own business. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said carefully, forcing a calm smile. "I was just having coffee." "I wasn't." "You were looking straight at my house," she interrupted, her voice rising. "For hours." "Hours?" "I had only been outside for 10 minutes." "That's not true," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "I just moved in. I've been unpacking." Her eyes narrowed. "I know what I saw," she snapped. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 20 years. I know when someone's up to no good." I opened my mouth to respond, but she wasn't waiting for an answer. With a sharp turn on her heel, she stormed back across the street, mumbling something under her breath. I exhaled slowly, watching her disappear into her house and slam the door behind her. A cold unease settled in my chest. Something told me this wasn't over. And I was right. It was only the beginning. Dan didn't believe me at first. When I told him about our neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, and her bizarre accusation, he laughed it off, saying she was probably just an eccentric old woman with too much time on her hands. I wanted to believe that too. I wanted to think that maybe she was just having a bad morning and that after cooling off, she'd realize how ridiculous she sounded. But as the day wore on, the feeling in my gut only got worse. By the next morning, it was clear that Mrs. Patterson wasn't done with us. I stepped outside to grab the mail, stretching as I took in the early sunlight. Across the street, the curtains of Mrs. Patterson's window twitched. She was watching again. I ignored it, willing myself not to give her the reaction she was clearly looking for. But as I walked back up my driveway, I noticed something even more unsettling. She wasn't alone. Mrs. Patterson was standing on her porch, whispering to a neighbor, a woman in her late 50s with graying hair and a cardigan wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The woman glanced in my direction, her lips pursing slightly, then turned back to Mrs. Patterson. Whatever she was saying, it wasn't good. I didn't think much of it until later that afternoon when I waved at a man walking his dog down the street. Instead of waving back, he averted his eyes and hurried past like I wasn't even there. Then, when I tried introducing myself to a couple unloading groceries, they visibly tensed, exchanging a look before offering curt nods and turning away. By the time I got back inside, my heart was pounding. This wasn't my imagination. Something was wrong. "Dan," I said, shutting the door behind me. "Something's happening. The neighbors, they're acting weird." He barely looked up from the box he was unpacking. "Weird how?" "I don't know," I admitted, rubbing my arms. "It's like they're avoiding me. I think Mrs. Patterson's telling people things about us." Dan set down the picture frame he was holding, finally paying attention. "Like what?" "I don't know." I threw my hands up. "She's making up stuff, Dan. I can feel it." Before he could respond, a loud knock sounded at the door. My stomach dropped. I knew who it was before I even opened it. Mrs. Patterson stood on our front step again, but this time, she wasn't alone. Standing beside her was a younger man, maybe in his early 30s, with short-cropped hair and a permanent scowl on his face. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had an aggressive posture that immediately put me on edge. "My son, Brad," Mrs. Patterson introduced with an almost triumphant smile, as if she had brought backup. Brad looked me up and down, his arms crossed over his chest. "My mom says you've been watching her house," he said, his voice cold. "That true?" Dan stepped up beside me, his presence solid and reassuring. "That's ridiculous," he said firmly. "We haven't been watching anything." Mrs. Patterson scoffed. "Oh, please. I've seen her out here, lurking. Standing in her yard, pretending to be gardening while she stares into my windows." I let out a frustrated breath. "I haven't been lurking. I've been unpacking. I've been trying to settle into my new home." "She doesn't feel safe," Brad interrupted, taking a step closer. "And I don't take it lightly when someone threatens my family." My pulse spiked. "Threaten? Are you serious?" "I don't like weirdos," Brad said, his eyes narrowing. "Especially the kind that hide cameras in their backyard. You think we don't know what you're doing?" Dan's expression darkened. "Okay, that's enough. You can't just come onto our property and make baseless accusations." Mrs. Patterson huffed. "Oh, we're just getting started." She jabbed a finger at me. "I've already spoken to the HOA. If you think you can move into this neighborhood and start spying on people, you've got another thing coming." Before I could argue, she turned on her heel and marched away, Brad following close behind. As they crossed the street, she glanced over her shoulder, eyes glinting with something close to satisfaction. Dan and I stood there in stunned silence. Then, almost like a final slap in the face, a car passing by slowed just enough for the driver to glare at us before speeding up again. I turned to Dan. "Now do you believe me?" His jaw tightened. "Yeah. I believe you." I swallowed hard, a sinking feeling settling in my chest. This was far from over. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside had me on edge. The weight of Mrs. Patterson's accusations and the way the neighborhood seemed to turn against us made my own home feel like a cage. Dan tried to reassure me, but even he was restless. By morning, things got worse. I stepped outside to water the plants, hoping some fresh air might help clear my mind. The moment I reached the front yard, a chill ran down my spine. There were footprints. Deep, muddy tracks trailing across our lawn, leading from the sidewalk straight to our front window. The strangest part? They weren't ours. I knelt down, touching the disturbed earth, my mind racing. Someone had been here, standing right in front of our house during the night. Watching. Dan came outside, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "What's wrong?" I pointed to the prints. His grogginess faded instantly. He crouched beside me, frowning. "These weren't here yesterday." "No, they weren't." I looked up, scanning the street. Mrs. Patterson's curtains were wide open. I knew she was watching. I could feel it. Before we could say another word, the unmistakable sound of a police siren cut through the quiet morning air. I turned just as a patrol car slowed in front of our house. 2 officers stepped out, 1 man, 1 woman. My heart hammered as I instinctively glanced toward Mrs. Patterson's house. Her front door was wide open, and she was standing there, arms crossed, smirking. Dan muttered a curse under his breath. "Of course." The male officer approached first. "Mr. and Mrs. Collins?" Dan nodded. "What's this about?" The female officer stepped forward, her tone professional but firm. "We received a report about suspicious activity in the neighborhood. Your neighbor claims you've been spying on her property and behaving in a way that makes her feel unsafe." I let out a bitter laugh before I could stop myself. "You're kidding, right?" The male officer's expression didn't waver. "Mind if we come inside to ask a few questions?" Dan exhaled through his nose but nodded. "Fine." As soon as we stepped inside, I could feel the tension thick in the air. The officers followed us to the living room, standing stiffly as if they were already convinced we were guilty. The female officer flipped open a notepad. "Mrs. Patterson claims she has photographic evidence of you trespassing on her property." I stiffened. "What?" She pulled out a printed photo. It was blurry, but it looked like a figure standing near the bushes of Mrs. Patterson's house, taken at night. The angle was unclear, the image grainy, but I could still make out a vague silhouette. My stomach turned. "That's not me." The male officer crossed his arms. "Are you saying she fabricated this?" "I'm saying I was inside my house all night. You can check our security footage." Dan pulled up the app on his phone, tapping through the clips. "Here." He turned the screen toward the officers, showing footage from the previous night. Our front door never opened after 9 p.m. The officers leaned in, watching the timestamps. The proof was right there. A beat of silence. The female officer exhaled. "That complicates things." She exchanged a glance with her partner before turning back to us. "Do you have any idea why she'd make these accusations?" I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Because she doesn't want us here. She's been harassing us since the day we moved in, telling the neighbors we're spying on her." "She's lying." The officers nodded, but something in their body language told me they weren't about to drag Mrs. Patterson out in cuffs. Instead, the male officer rubbed his jaw and said, "Look, this seems like a neighborly dispute that's getting out of hand. Since there's no concrete evidence of wrongdoing, we'll just give a warning to both parties and suggest you stay away from each other." Dan scoffed. "A warning? She's the one making false police reports." The female officer sighed. "I understand this is frustrating. But unless there's proof of intent to harass, there's nothing criminal here." I clenched my fists. Proof? What more proof did they need? She was watching me, stalking me, now outright fabricating evidence. They left soon after, promising to speak with Mrs. Patterson and keep an eye on the situation. As they pulled away, I turned to Dan. "This isn't over." He nodded, jaw tight. "I know." Across the street, Mrs. Patterson stood on her porch, smiling, holding her mug like she'd just won. And the worst part? I knew she wasn't done yet. The next few days were eerily quiet, but the damage had already been done. I could feel it in the way our neighbors avoided eye contact, crossed the street when they saw me, or abruptly ended conversations whenever I approached. It was subtle, but it was everywhere: whispers behind closed doors, judgmental glances from porches, even a few passive-aggressive remarks about respecting community privacy in the neighborhood Facebook group. Mrs. Patterson had poisoned the well, and I had no way to undo it. Dan and I tried to go about our lives, hoping the storm would pass, but the silence was only a warning before the next strike. It came in the form of an envelope taped to our door. I found it early one morning, crisp white paper with my name scrawled in bold letters. My stomach clenched the second I saw it. I already knew who it was from. Tearing it open, I scanned the first few lines before the words blurred together in a mix of shock and fury. A restraining order. Filed against me. Dan heard my sharp intake of breath and rushed over. What is it? I shoved the paper toward him, my hands shaking. She filed a restraining order, Dan. Against me. His eyes darted across the document, his expression darkening with each word. This is insane. I pressed my fingers against my temples, trying to steady my breathing. She's making it look like I'm the one harassing her. That I'm some kind of threat. Dan clenched his jaw, flipping through the pages. She cited repeated unwanted surveillance, harassment, and intimidation. This is a joke. She's the one who won't leave us alone. I let out a bitter laugh, though there was no humor in it. She's flipping the entire situation on us. And now, if I so much as look in her direction, she can call the cops and get me arrested. It didn't take long for me to realize that this wasn't just about inconveniencing us anymore. This was an attack. A calculated move to drive us out. That same afternoon, I got an email from the HOA, a subject line that made my stomach drop: formal complaint notice, urgent action required. I didn't even need to read it to know what it was about. I was being accused of violating multiple community rules. Lawn maintenance neglect. Noise disturbances. Trespassing. Completely fabricated nonsense. Dan stood behind me, reading over my shoulder. We've only lived here for a few weeks. How could we have multiple noise violations? I clicked open the attachments. She had complaints from neighbors, all anonymous, of course. Statements claiming that I had been wandering the streets at night, watching houses, that I had been confrontational when approached. It was absurd. But I knew exactly what she was doing. She's building a paper trail, I muttered. The restraining order. The police reports. Now the HOA complaints. She's making it look like we're the problem so they'll have reason to get rid of us. Dan's hands curled into fists. We need to fight back. But before we could even strategize, the next blow came. That evening, Mrs. Patterson trespassed onto our property. I was sitting in the living room when I noticed movement through the window. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but as I leaned forward, my heart slammed against my ribs. She was in our yard. Holding her phone up. Taking pictures. Fury burned through me as I bolted to the door, throwing it open. What the hell do you think you're doing? She turned, feigning surprise, but the satisfied smirk on her face told me she had been waiting for this moment. Oh, she said, lowering her phone. Just documenting. I stormed down the steps, barely able to contain my rage. You're trespassing. She scoffed, crossing her arms. I'm standing on the sidewalk. She wasn't. She was a good 2 feet onto our lawn. I pulled out my phone and started recording. If you don't leave, I'm calling the police. Her eyes flashed. Go ahead, she taunted. But let me remind you, you're the one with a restraining order. You're the one harassing me. The realization hit me like a freight train. She wasn't here to take pictures. She was here to provoke me. To make me react. To catch me on camera, threatening her so she could call the police and add it to her growing list of evidence. She was setting a trap. I forced myself to step back, inhaling sharply. Leave. Now. For a split second, her smirk wavered. Like she was disappointed that I wasn't taking the bait. Then she shrugged. You can't hide behind cameras forever, she said, turning on her heel. This neighborhood doesn't want people like you here. I stood there, fists clenched, watching her stroll back across the street, victorious. Dan stepped beside me, voice low. That was a warning. I nodded. She's not stopping until we're gone. And as I watched her smile smugly from her porch, sipping from her ever-present mug, I realized something else. She thought she'd already won. I knew we couldn't let her win. If we gave in, if we backed down, we'd be exactly what she wanted us to be, another set of neighbors she bullied out of the neighborhood. But I wasn't going to be another name on her list. Dan and I started gathering everything, every police visit, every false accusation, every piece of security footage, every fabricated complaint. We weren't going to sit quietly and wait for her to destroy our reputation. We were going to fight back. The turning point came when an unexpected ally stepped forward. Mr. Calloway, one of the oldest residents in the neighborhood, stopped me while I was walking to the mailbox one morning. His eyes flicked toward Mrs. Patterson's house before lowering his voice. She's done this before, he muttered. I stared at him in shock as he explained how Karen had made false reports about past neighbors, how she'd used the HOA as a weapon to control who stayed and who left. And how, for years, she had been breaking HOA rules herself. That was all we needed. Dan and I compiled everything and went straight to the HOA, exposing her illegal backyard additions, unauthorized property modifications, and even past complaints against her for harassment. When confronted with undeniable proof, the HOA had no choice but to fine her thousands of dollars and put her under formal review. The tables had turned. Then, as if the universe was working in our favor, Karen snapped. She must have realized she was losing, because one evening, she stormed onto our property and started screaming, right in front of our security cameras. She called me every name in the book, claimed we had ruined her life, and in a moment of sheer rage, shoved me. The next day, we handed the footage over to the police. She was arrested for trespassing and assault. And just like that, the woman who had made our lives miserable was suddenly the one facing real consequences. In the end, Mrs. Patterson had no choice but to sell her house and leave the neighborhood in disgrace. The same people who once whispered about me started whispering about her. Neighbors who had once avoided us apologized, some even admitting they had been afraid of her, too. As for Dan and me, we finally got what we wanted from the start, a peaceful home. No glares from across the street, no police at our door, no false accusations looming over us. Just silence. But looking back, I can't help but wonder, how many people like Karen are out there, using HOAs, fake complaints, and intimidation to control their communities. Have you ever felt powerless against an HOA, or a Karen? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.